A land full of people who never asked to be discovered. A continent that would soon become the stage for ambition, greed, rebellion, and survival. Tonight, you're not just hearing history. You're stepping inside it. Welcome to the channel. If you love deep, real stories that explain how the world became what it is, make sure you subscribe, because this is not a short journey. Now, let's begin at the very beginning. Before there were presidents. Before borders were drawn. Before flags were stitched and raised. There was already a world here. A living, breathing continent filled with voices, languages, songs, and stories that had been passed down for thousands of years. This story does not begin with discovery. Because nothing here was ever lost. This story begins with interruption. Welcome to the channel. If you love deep, real history that feels like a story, not a textbook, make sure you subscribe, because this is not just about America. It's about how power, greed, fear, and ambition reshape the world. Now get comfortable. Because this is where everything begins. A land that was never empty. Long before the word America existed, this land had names, many names. Forests stretched endlessly. Rivers carried food, trade, and stories. Mountains marked sacred boundaries. The land wasn't owned. It was shared, respected, and remembered. Millions of indigenous people lived across this continent. Not one culture. Not one language. Not one way of life. There were farmers and hunters. Traders and builders. Nations with laws, diplomacy, and complex governments. Some lived in large cities. Some moved with the seasons. Some built massive earth mounds that still stand today. They adapted to deserts, frozen plains, swamps, coastlines, and forests, without destroying the land they depended on. This wasn't a wilderness waiting for civilization. It was civilization. And then, across the ocean, another world was falling apart. Europe's hunger. By the late 1400s, Europe was restless. Kings were fighting kings. Churches were fighting churches. Empires were bleeding money from endless wars. And everyone wanted the same things. Gold. Power. Control. And spices, yes, spices. Spices meant wealth. Wealth meant armies. Armies meant dominance. But the routes to Asia were controlled, dangerous, and expensive. So Europe looked west. Not because it was brave, but because it was desperate. Ships were built quickly. Maps were incomplete. Diseases were packed unknowingly in human bodies. Sailors didn't know where they were going. They only knew they were promised riches. When the first European explorers arrived, they didn't come as guests. They came as claimants. Contact before conquest. The first encounters were confusing. Indigenous people didn't understand why strangers would cross an ocean just to plant flags in soil that wasn't theirs. Europeans didn't understand societies that didn't revolve around money, land ownership, or monarchy. But the most devastating weapon wasn't guns or swords. It was disease. Smallpox. Measles. Influenza. Illness spread faster than soldiers ever could. Entire villages disappeared without a single battle. By the time large-scale colonization began, many indigenous nations were already weakened, not by war, but by invisible enemies. This wasn't accidental. It became convenient. The first claims. Spain arrived first in large numbers. They moved through the south and west, claiming land, converting people, extracting wealth. Gold and silver flowed back to Europe. Blood soaked into the soil. France focused on rivers and trade routes, building relationships but still claiming power. The Dutch tried their luck briefly, trading and settling along the coast. But England had bigger plans. England didn't want trading posts. England wanted permanent control. England's risky gamble. By the early 1600s, England began planting colonies. Not families. Not farmers. But investors and gentlemen. The first English settlement struggled immediately. The land was unfamiliar. The climate unforgiving. The people unprepared. Food ran out. Disease spread. Desperation followed. People starved while surrounded by land that could feed them, if they only knew how. Survival came not from English planning, but from indigenous knowledge. Yet instead of gratitude, suspicion grew. Faith, fear, and control. Soon, another group arrived, not chasing gold, but control over belief. They were deeply religious. Strict. Unforgiving. They believed God had chosen them, and that anyone who disagreed was a threat. They didn't land where they planned. They weren't prepared for the climate. Many didn't survive their first winter. Once again, indigenous people helped them live. Once again, that help was not repaid. What began as fragile cooperation slowly turned into displacement. Land was fenced. Rules were enforced. Punishment became normal. Religion wasn't just belief, it was law. Colonies multiply, tensions grow. Over the next century, more colonies appeared. Each had a personality. Some were ruled by religious law. Some were built on cash crops. Some existed as experiments that failed almost immediately. But one thing united them all. They were controlled from far away. Taxes were decided by people who never set foot on the land. Laws were enforced by rulers who never felt the consequences. At the same time, enslaved Africans were brought in chains. Slavery wasn't an accident. It was a system. It powered farms. It built wealth. It shaped social hierarchies. Freedom existed. But only for a few. Two truths at once. By the mid-1700s, the colonies lived in contradiction. They believed in liberty. They practiced oppression. They demanded rights. They denied humanity. They called themselves free, while benefiting from bondage. And yet, something dangerous was forming. A shared identity. Not British enough. Not independent enough. Just, frustrated. The calm before the storm. Britain needed money. Wars had been fought to protect the colonies. Debt piled up. So taxes increased. To Britain, this was reasonable. To the colonies, it was betrayal. They had no voice. No representation. No say. Anger spread through pamphlets, speeches, and whispered conversations. This wasn't rebellion yet. But it was brewing. What started as survival turned into resentment. And resentment, when shared, becomes a movement. By the time the colonies realized they were being controlled, it was already too late to go back. Because once people begin to question power, they don't stop at questions. They start demanding answers. And when answers don't come, they start preparing for something much louder. The colonies didn't wake up one morning and decide to rebel. Revolutions don't work like that. They grow quietly, inside kitchens, taverns, churches, and crowded streets, in places where ordinary people talk about unfair prices, unfair laws, and futures that feel smaller every year. By the mid-1700s, the British colonies were no longer fragile experiments. They were growing, crowded, and confident. People were born here now. They didn't remember England. They didn't feel English. Yet England still claimed ownership over everything: land, trade, money, and law. And that tension was becoming unbearable. Britain had just fought expensive wars across the globe. Wars that protected the colonies from foreign enemies. Those wars left the British government drowning in debt. So Parliament did what governments always do when money runs out. They looked for someone else to pay. The colonies seemed like the perfect answer. Taxes were introduced one after another. Taxes on sugar. Taxes on paper. Taxes on everyday goods. To Britain, these were small, reasonable contributions. To the colonists, they felt like punishment. Not because of the money alone, but because of how it was decided. No colonial representatives sat in Parliament. No colonial voices were heard. The phrase spread quickly from town to town. No taxation without representation. It wasn't poetry yet. But it was powerful. And power scares empires. British officials didn't back down. Instead, they sent more soldiers. Red coats filled streets that once belonged only to locals. Their presence was meant to maintain order. Instead, it created fear and resentment. Soldiers took jobs from workers. They enforced laws aggressively. They answered only to the crown. Tensions rose daily. Arguments became fights. Fights became violence. Then one night, everything snapped. A crowd gathered. Insults were exchanged. A shot was fired. When the smoke cleared, people were dead. The incident would later be remembered as a massacre. Whether it truly was or not mattered less than how it felt. To the colonists, it was proof. Proof that the crown no longer cared about their lives. Words became weapons. Printers worked non-stop. Pamphlets flooded the streets. Writers argued that kings were dangerous. That power should come from the people. Ideas spread faster than soldiers ever could. Britain tried to regain control. They tightened laws. They closed ports. They punished entire cities. When colonists responded by destroying a shipment of tea, a symbol of unfair taxation, Britain answered with force. Harbors were shut down. Local governments were stripped of power. Troops were quartered in private homes. What Britain saw as discipline, the colonies saw as tyranny. And once tyranny is named, it cannot be ignored. Still, not everyone wanted rebellion. Some feared chaos more than control. Some remained loyal to the crown. Some simply wanted peace. Families were divided. Friends stopped speaking. The colonies weren't united. Not yet. But something strange was happening. Different colonies, with different cultures, economies, and beliefs, were starting to see themselves as connected. An attack on one felt like an attack on all. Meetings were held. Letters were exchanged. Plans were whispered. They weren't calling it independence yet. But they were preparing for resistance. Britain, growing impatient, decided to strike first. Weapons were stored. Militias were forming. The crown wanted to crush rebellion before it spread. Troops were sent under cover of night. But the colonies were watching. Messengers rode ahead. Warnings spread. When British soldiers reached a small town at dawn, they found armed civilians waiting. No one knows who fired first. History never does. But once the first shot rang out, there was no turning back. It echoed far beyond that town. It echoed across a continent. The rebellion was no longer theoretical. It was real. Blood had been spilled. And whether they were ready or not, the colonies were now at war with the most powerful empire on earth. Some believed the rebellion would fail immediately. Britain had the strongest navy, a professional army, global resources. The colonies had farmers, shopkeepers, and volunteers. On paper, it wasn't a fair fight. But revolutions aren't won on paper. They're fueled by belief. And belief was spreading fast. As the fighting expanded, one truth became clear. This wasn't just a protest anymore. This was a fight over who had the right to rule. A distant king. Or the people living on the land. The answer would reshape history. Resistance turns into full rebellion. And the colonies make a decision that can never be undone. Once blood is spilled, there is no neutral ground. Every silence becomes a choice. Every delay becomes a side. And the colonies were about to make the most dangerous decision of their lives. The war did not begin with confidence. It began with doubt. After the first shots were fired, panic spread just as fast as pride. People realized what they had done. They hadn't just protested a law or embarrassed a government. They had challenged an empire that ruled oceans, commanded armies, and crushed rebellions without hesitation. Some colonists celebrated the stand they had taken. Others packed their belongings, terrified of what retaliation would look like. Because now Britain wasn't dealing with complaints. It was dealing with defiance. British leaders were furious. To them, the colonies were not partners. They were property. And property that rebelled needed to be corrected, forcefully and publicly. More troops were sent. More ships arrived. Generals with strict orders stepped onto colonial soil, convinced the rebellion would collapse the moment real pressure was applied. But pressure has a strange effect on people. Sometimes it breaks them. Sometimes it hardens them. Across the colonies, militias formed almost overnight. Farmers left fields. Shopkeepers closed stores. Young men who had never fired a weapon picked up muskets with shaking hands. They weren't trained soldiers. They didn't march perfectly. They didn't wear matching uniforms. But they believed they were defending something that belonged to them. Their homes. Their communities. Their future. The early battles were chaotic and brutal. Supplies were short. Ammunition was inconsistent. Commanders argued constantly. Victories were rare and costly. Many began to question whether rebellion had been a terrible mistake. The British Army was disciplined, experienced, and relentless. They captured cities. They pushed rebels back. They reminded everyone who held power. And yet, the war didn't end. Because the rebels refused to disappear. They retreated when necessary. They struck when possible. They learned quickly. This wasn't the kind of war Britain was used to fighting. There were no clear front lines. No single capital that could be taken to end everything. The land itself worked against the empire. Forests swallowed armies. Roads turned to mud. Weather destroyed plans. The rebels knew the terrain. They knew the people. They knew where to hide. Slowly, painfully, the impossible began to look possible. Still, the colonies were deeply divided. Not everyone wanted independence. Some believed reconciliation was still possible. Some feared total collapse without British structure. Some benefited from the existing system and wanted it preserved. Families were torn apart. Neighbors stopped trusting one another. Choosing rebellion didn't just mean fighting Britain. It meant risking everything familiar. In the midst of this chaos, leaders began to emerge, not perfect heroes, but flawed individuals trying to hold together a movement that could collapse at any moment. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Arguments filled rooms thick with sweat and fear. One question dominated every conversation. What exactly are we fighting for? Was it fair taxation? More representation? Or something far more dangerous? Independence. To speak that word out loud was terrifying. Independence meant there was no turning back. No apology that could undo it. No compromise that could restore the old order. It meant building something entirely new. And that raised another problem. If they broke free, what would replace the crown? No king. No empire. No clear blueprint. Just an idea. That power could come from the people. An idea that had never been tested on this scale before. As the war dragged on, the need for clarity became urgent. Soldiers needed a reason to keep fighting. Civilians needed a reason to keep sacrificing. The world needed to understand why this conflict mattered. So the colonists did what they had learned to do best. They wrote. One document would attempt to explain everything. Not just the anger. Not just the war. But the philosophy behind it. It would argue that power was not inherited by birth. That governments existed to serve people. That when a government failed, it could be replaced. It was bold. It was dangerous. And if it failed, the men who signed it would be executed as traitors. They knew that. And they signed anyway. When the declaration was announced, celebrations erupted in some places. In others, silence. Because now the line was drawn clearly. This was no longer a rebellion inside an empire. This was the birth of a new identity. A new name. A new enemy. Britain responded exactly as expected. With force. The war intensified. Losses mounted. Hope faded and returned in waves. There were moments when defeat seemed inevitable. Moments when the rebellion was held together by nothing but stubborn belief. But belief can be powerful. Especially when people are fighting for a future they've already imagined. By the end of this phase of the war, one truth had settled in. The colonies could not go back. No matter how hard it became. No matter how many lives were lost. They had crossed the point of no return. And now they had to prove that their ideas were worth the cost. The rebels faced their greatest challenge yet. How to govern themselves while still fighting for survival. Winning a war is one thing. Knowing what to do after you win is something else entirely. And the colonies were about to learn that freedom without a plan can be just as dangerous as oppression. By the time the fighting slowed and Britain finally accepted what it had lost, the colonies stood at an edge they had never imagined reaching. They had survived. Against all odds. Against the strongest empire in the world. Against hunger, fear, and exhaustion. They were free. But freedom arrived with an uncomfortable question. Now what? There was no king anymore. No empire issuing commands. No single authority holding everything together. Only 13 former colonies, different in culture, economy, religion, and priorities, suddenly expected to function as one nation. And unity, it turned out, was much harder than rebellion. During the war, cooperation had been necessary. After the war, cooperation became optional. Each state saw itself as sovereign. Independent. Suspicious of anyone telling it what to do. They had just fought a revolution to escape control. The last thing they wanted was a new version of it. So the first attempt at a national government was intentionally weak. Very weak. It was built on trust, not force. On agreement, not authority. There was no strong leader. No power to collect taxes. No way to enforce laws. The government could ask states for money. States could say no. And often did. At first, this seemed fine. Even ideal. No tyranny. No centralized power. No distant ruler. But problems appeared almost immediately. The war had left the new nation deeply in debt. Soldiers hadn't been paid properly. Supplies had been borrowed. Foreign allies expected repayment. But without the power to tax, the national government was broke. States argued constantly. Some were rich. Some were struggling. Some wanted strong trade rules. Others wanted complete independence. There was no common currency. No unified economic policy. No shared vision for the future. Disagreements that once hid behind the urgency of war now surfaced openly. Loudly. And dangerously. Farmers began losing land. Veterans returned home to poverty. Economic panic spread. When groups of desperate citizens began protesting violently, the national government watched helplessly. It had no army to respond. No authority to act. That moment terrified the leaders who had once celebrated freedom. Because chaos looked frighteningly close. Slowly, a realization spread among the most influential figures. They had gone too far in weakening their own government. Freedom without structure was unstable. Liberty without order could collapse. The same people who once feared centralized power now feared the absence of it. But how do you strengthen a government without recreating the tyranny you just escaped? That question haunted every conversation. So they decided to meet. Quietly at first. Then with urgency. Representatives from the states gathered behind closed doors, officially to fix a few problems. Unofficially, to rethink everything. What followed was tense, exhausting, and deeply divided. Big states argued with small states. Rich states argued with poor states. Northern interests clashed with southern ones. One issue overshadowed all others. Power. Who should have it? How much should they get? And how could it be controlled? Some wanted a strong central government with real authority. Others feared that would become another monarchy in disguise. Compromise became the only path forward. Not because everyone agreed, but because failure meant collapse. They debated representation. They debated leadership. They debated the balance between state power and national power. They debated humanity itself, deciding who counted and who didn't. The result was not perfect. It was not clean. It was stitched together by necessity. A framework designed to prevent tyranny while still allowing order. A system meant to evolve, not remain frozen. When the final document was presented, reactions were mixed. Some celebrated it as genius. Some feared it as dangerous. Some accepted it reluctantly. But everyone understood one thing. This document would decide whether the experiment survived. Or failed. Approval was not automatic. Each state had to agree. And agreement was anything but guaranteed. The debates spilled into public life. People argued in taverns, newspapers, and town squares. Was this new government a protector? Or a threat? Promises were demanded. Safeguards were added. Only then did acceptance begin to spread. Slowly. Carefully. And with deep mistrust. When the new system finally came into effect, the nation exhaled. For the first time, the former colonies were no longer just united by war. They were united by law. But the hardest truth remained unspoken. This system had solved some problems. And created others. Because unity came at a cost. And the consequences of those compromises would shape everything that came next. The new nation looks outward, expanding, growing, and chasing prosperity. While planting the seeds of its deepest future conflict. The war was over. The nation had a system. The future looked wide open. And that's exactly when the most dangerous decisions were made. Part 5. With independence secured and a new system of government in place, the young nation turned its attention outward. Not inward. Not toward healing wounds or correcting injustices. Outward. To land. To opportunity. To growth. The belief was simple and powerful. If the country kept expanding, it would stay strong. If it stopped, it would collapse. So expansion wasn't just a choice. It became a mission. The continent stretched endlessly to the west, filled with rivers, forests, plains, and mountains that many Americans believed were theirs by destiny. Never mind who already lived there. Never mind the promises already broken. The land was seen as empty because acknowledging otherwise would complicate everything. So settlers moved. Wagons rolled west. Farms appeared. Towns followed. With every mile gained, the nation felt more confident. But beneath that confidence, a question refused to stay quiet. Who would benefit from this expansion? And at what cost? The economy of the young nation began to boom. Trade increased. Ports grew busy. Factories appeared. In the southern regions, agriculture dominated. Cotton became king. But cotton required labor, brutal, exhausting labor. And that labor came from enslaved people. Slavery, which had never disappeared after independence, now became even more deeply embedded in the nation's growth. The contradiction sharpened. A country founded on liberty relied on bondage. A nation that spoke of equality enforced hierarchy. These weren't accidental flaws. They were structural. And expansion made them worse. Every new territory raised the same explosive question. Would it allow slavery? Or forbid it? Each decision shifted the balance of power. Each compromise delayed a reckoning. Political debates grew louder. Tempers flared. Leaders who once stood shoulder to shoulder now faced each other as opponents. The nation was growing, but unity was thinning. Expansion wasn't only about economics. It was about control. Treaties were signed, and ignored. Agreements were made, and broken. Indigenous nations were pressured, displaced, or forcibly removed. Entire communities were pushed off ancestral lands to make room for farms, railroads, and cities. The official language spoke of progress. The reality was violence, loss, and survival. And still, the nation told itself this was necessary. That growth justified the cost. As the country expanded, so did its influence. Foreign powers watched carefully. Some feared this new nation. Others underestimated it. Inside its borders, confidence grew. But so did division. The northern regions industrialized quickly. Factories replaced farms. Cities filled with workers. Immigrants arrived in waves, chasing opportunity and escaping hardship. The South remained tied to land and labor. Different economies. Different priorities. Different visions of the future. These differences didn't immediately explode. They simmered. Held together by compromise and denial. Leaders created temporary solutions, agreements meant to calm tensions, not resolve them. They believed time would soften the problem. Time did the opposite. It sharpened it. As decades passed, voices grew louder. Some demanded the nation live up to its ideals. Others demanded preservation of tradition. Each side believed the future depended on winning. The middle ground narrowed. Expansion continued. New states entered the Union. Each one became another battlefield, not with weapons, but with laws and votes. The question of power could no longer be avoided. Who had the right to decide the nation's direction? Those who benefited from the old system? Or those demanding change? The balance became fragile. Dangerously fragile. By the time the nation reached the middle of the 19th century, it stood at a crossroads. It was wealthier than ever. Larger than ever. More influential than ever. And more divided than ever. The compromises that once held it together were cracking. The expansion that fueled growth had also exposed every unresolved contradiction. Freedom versus control. Equality versus hierarchy. Union versus division. The future would no longer be decided by debate alone. Something was coming. Something violent. Something final. The nation faces its greatest internal collapse. A conflict that will decide whether it survives at all. All the compromises were exhausted. All the warnings were ignored. And when a nation runs out of words, it turns to weapons. By the time the breaking point arrived, it didn't feel sudden. It felt inevitable. For years, the country had been arguing with itself, over land, labor, power, and the meaning of freedom. Every solution was temporary. Every agreement was a delay. Each generation passed the problem forward, hoping someone else would find the courage to resolve it. Instead, the problem grew teeth. The nation was no longer just divided by opinions. It was divided by identity. Entire regions began to see themselves as fundamentally different societies, forced into the same political structure. What once felt like disagreement now felt like threat. When a new leader was elected without the support of the southern states, fear turned into action. Not debate. Not negotiation. Separation. One by one, states declared they were leaving. They argued that they were protecting their way of life. They claimed the central government had become dangerous. But beneath every justification sat the same truth. They feared losing control over a system that powered their wealth. The Union fractured. What had once been unimaginable now became real. Two sides. Two flags. Two futures. The war began not with a massive invasion, but with a symbolic strike, a declaration made in gunfire. The message was clear. This conflict would not be solved peacefully. The early days of the war shattered illusions on both sides. Many believed it would be short. They were wrong. It became a grinding, brutal struggle fought in fields, forests, cities, and homes. Brothers fought brothers. Neighbors fought neighbors. Families were ripped apart by loyalty and fear. Battles were chaotic and unforgiving. Weapons evolved faster than tactics. Bodies fell faster than they could be counted. Camps filled with disease. Hospitals overflowed. Entire towns were destroyed. The cost was unimaginable. And it kept rising. The war was not just about territory. It was about survival. One side fought to preserve unity. The other fought to preserve autonomy. But both sides paid the same price in blood. As the conflict dragged on, desperation replaced optimism. Victories felt hollow. Defeats felt endless. The nation began to understand that there would be no clean ending. Only damage. Then came a turning point. A declaration that shifted the moral center of the war. What had once been framed as a fight to preserve unity was now openly connected to freedom. Not freedom for some, but freedom as principle. This decision reshaped the war. It strengthened resolve. It weakened opposition. It changed how the world watched. But it did not end the violence. If anything, it intensified it. As the final year approached, the nation was exhausted. Resources were depleted. Morale was fragile. Loss had become routine. Entire regions lay in ruins. Cities burned. Fields were destroyed. The economy collapsed in places where it once thrived. When surrender finally came, it was quiet. No celebration. No triumph. Only relief and grief. The war ended. But peace did not begin immediately. Freedom had been declared. But equality had not been delivered. The system that caused the war was dismantled, legally. But its beliefs survived. Rebuilding began. So did resistance. Laws changed faster than hearts. And while the nation had survived its greatest test, it emerged scarred, traumatized, and deeply uncertain about what came next. The war had answered one question. The Union would survive. But it left another unanswered. What kind of nation would it become? The country struggles to rebuild, modernize, and redefine itself. While old wounds refuse to heal. The war was over. The damage was not. And rebuilding a nation is far harder than breaking one apart. When the fighting finally stopped, silence spread across the land. Not peace, silence. The kind that follows devastation, when people are still alive but unsure how to live again. Cities were broken. Farms were burned. Families were missing fathers, sons, brothers. And millions of newly freed people stood at the edge of freedom without land, money, or protection. The nation had survived. But survival came with a bill. Rebuilding began immediately, and imperfectly. The government promised renewal. New laws were written. Old systems were officially dismantled. For a brief moment, hope flickered. Formerly enslaved people voted, held office, built schools, and formed communities with determination that stunned the world. It was one of the most radical transformations the country had ever seen. And it terrified those who had once ruled without question. Backlash arrived quickly. Laws were bent. Rules were rewritten. Violence replaced debate. Progress was met with resistance so fierce that it reshaped the nation's future. Freedom existed on paper. Reality was far harsher. As the country struggled to redefine itself, something else was happening. Industry exploded. Factories rose where fields once stood. Railroads cut through mountains and plains. Machines replaced hands. The nation transformed faster than its people could adapt. Cities filled with workers chasing survival. Immigrants arrived in waves, carrying hope, fear, and exhaustion. Opportunity existed, but so did exploitation. Children worked long hours. Laborers were crushed by unsafe conditions. Wealth piled up at the top. A new kind of power emerged. Not kings. Not emperors. Corporations. And they reshaped the country quietly. While the nation industrialized, it also expanded its influence beyond its borders. It fought wars overseas. Claimed new territories. Asserted itself as a rising force on the global stage. The country that once feared empires now behaved like one. At home, movements rose to challenge inequality. Workers demanded rights. Women demanded recognition. Voices once silenced demanded space. Some progress was made. Much was delayed. The nation moved forward unevenly, one step ahead, two steps sideways. Then the world collapsed. Economies crashed. Jobs vanished. Confidence evaporated. For the first time in generations, Americans questioned whether the system itself was broken. The government stepped in where it never had before. Rules changed. Safety nets appeared. Power shifted. Just as stability returned, the world plunged into war again. This time, the nation entered not as a survivor, but as a leader. The conflict reshaped everything. Industry boomed. Technology advanced. The country emerged stronger, richer, and more influential than ever. And deeply changed. After the war, the nation stood at the center of the world. A superpower. But power brought responsibility, and fear. New enemies emerged. Ideologies clashed. The threat of total destruction loomed constantly. At home, people questioned authority again. They challenged segregation. They challenged war. They challenged tradition. The streets filled with protest. Change arrived slowly, often violently. But it arrived. By the end of the 20th century, the nation was no longer defined by survival alone. It was defined by contradiction, unmatched influence, and deep division. Technological brilliance, and social unrest. Global leadership, and internal doubt. The experiment was still running. Still unfinished. Still fragile. We arrive at the present. A nation shaped by everything that came before, still asking who it is, and who it wants to become. History doesn't end. It echoes. Every choice made before this moment is still speaking. Sometimes loudly, sometimes in whispers. But always shaping what comes next. Part 8. By the time the nation stepped into the modern age, it carried everything with it. Victories. Failures. Promises kept. Promises broken. Nothing had been erased. Only layered. The country had become powerful, economically, militarily, culturally. Its influence stretched far beyond its borders. Music, movies, technology, money, and ideas traveled faster than ever before. To many around the world, it looked unstoppable. To many inside it, it felt uncertain. Because power does not bring clarity. It brings questions. As technology accelerated, life changed faster than any generation before could fully process. Cities expanded upward and outward. Screens replaced paper. Voices multiplied. Information became instant. So did outrage. The same system that allowed innovation also magnified division. People no longer argued only with neighbors. They argued with millions of strangers at once. The nation became louder, but not necessarily more united. Old struggles took new forms. Racial inequality did not disappear, it adapted. Economic gaps widened. Trust in institutions weakened. Some demanded accountability. Others demanded tradition. Both believed they were defending the country. Both believed the future depended on them. Fear returned, not of empires, but of one another. Global crises tested the nation repeatedly. Terrorism. Financial collapse. War fatigue. Pandemics. Each moment exposed strengths and weaknesses. The country showed resilience, again and again. But also exhaustion. People questioned leadership. Questioned truth. Questioned whether the system still worked for everyone. The experiment felt fragile. Not because it was new, but because it was old and constantly adapting. Yet even in uncertainty, life continued. Communities formed. Movements rose. Change pushed forward, unevenly, imperfectly, but persistently. New generations challenged what they inherited. They questioned stories they were told. They demanded fuller truths. They refused silence. This tension, between past and future, became the defining feature of the present. The nation now exists in paradox. It is deeply divided, yet deeply interconnected. It argues constantly, yet continues to function. It doubts itself, yet keeps moving forward. Some call that weakness. Others call it democracy. The truth is simpler and harder to accept. This country was never meant to be finished. It was built as a process, not a conclusion. Every generation inherits it unfinished. Every generation leaves it altered. The question has never been whether the nation is perfect. It has always been whether it can face itself honestly. And choose what to become next. This story is not about heroes or villains alone. It is about people. Flawed. Hopeful. Contradictory. Trying, again and again, to build something that lasts longer than fear. And now, that story includes you. Before you go, tell me in the comments. Globe showing Europe, Africa, which part of the country, or the world, are you watching from? Alarm clock, and what time is it right now where you are? History is still unfolding. And wherever you are, you're part of it.